Hey guys, how's it going? I'm back here with another video, and today I decided to bring this video which a lot of you guys have been wanting me to make, which is a video where I go over some of the new changes that were made to the new version of React, which is React 18. Now, since my channel is mostly React based, I know a lot of you guys have been requesting this, maybe just wanting to know my opinions on the changes or just go over some of the changes, so I decided to do it this way. In this video, I will be going over an overview of the main changes made to React and how it will impact every developer. And then I'll make another video where I will go over all of the new hooks introduced to React 18. There are a lot of new things and it would obviously not fit all in one video, but in this video, I'll be going over the main things that I think you should know. So with that in mind, if you could leave a like before we get into the video, I would massively appreciate it. It will help push my videos to more people. And yeah, let's get into the video. Okay everyone, so the first change I want to go over is actually kind of different from the other ones because this is the only change which is necessary for you to know if you're trying to migrate from a React application from a lower version to React 18. The reason for this is because there are some changes to the Index.js file when you're setting up an application, so I wanted to just explain really quickly before we get into the more important topics. So this is how a normal React application would look like in its index.js file in previous versions before React 18. You see, this is probably what you're used to. However, it doesn't look like this anymore. There was actually a couple changes to how your app component is rendered and how your application is created. In the new version of React, this is how you actually should have your index.js file configured. I wouldn't worry that much just looking over all of this, just most of it is just semantics, but you can see there is a new function, which is the create root function, which is used to actually put the root div inside of your application, and now this is how it is created. So I wouldn't worry that much about this. I would just know that if you're migrating a project, I would probably just copy and paste this code over here and put it in your index.js file in order to make it work. So this was basically it, and now let's get into the more important stuff. The first one is the idea of automatic batching. So automatic batching is actually something really interesting because it technically requires no changes from our end. It is something that runs kind of like behind the scenes. So we will basically not have to use any new functions or use anything that is new. It is just something that will already run whenever you have the React 18 version and will actually have some sort of really positive impact. So basically, batching in itself in React just means that if two states are changed in sequence, the component will only re-render once. So as many of you might know, every time a state changes its value, React will check to see the value of the state. If it is different from what it was before, it will trigger a re-render of the component in order for the component now to display the new value. But if two states are changed in sequence, so like you have you're changing a state in one line and then right after it you're changing another state, it doesn't make sense for the component to re-render twice, right? Because you're changing the state two different states, but they could easily be batched up into a single re-render and prevent unnecessary re-renders, right? You might not know this, but this actually already works ever since React 17, but it only works in response to browser events, such as inside of a function that is called when you click a button, something like that, right? However, now in React 18, automatic batching will occur everywhere, regardless of its location. You don't have to do anything about it. It will be done completely automatically. Main places would be like, for example, you're fetching data and or inside of a promise or something like that, right? Any kind of event, any kind of places you put two states being changed together, it will only trigger, it will batch the changes together and only re-render once. This is amazing for large-scale applications. It will also be good for small projects, but the real importance here is improving performance. And if you're working in a large-scale application, performance is almost everything. So this is where I see the most positive impact. Now, the second change is actually something that isn't that important in my opinion. However, it is important for you to start using it, if that makes sense. Basically, I'm talking about the UseId Hook. Now, this one is really cool because it is just a nice way to make it easier for developers to follow best practices. So whenever you have, for example, a form with inputs like you see in the screen, it is best practices for you to add a label to each input where the user can click on the label and it will automatically focus on a corresponding input. Now, this is something very common even outside of React applications, and to do this, you basically just have, for each input, you'll have a label tag, and inside of the label tag, you'll use the for attribute. Now, in React, we don't have the for attribute, we actually use something called HTML4, and it's basically the same thing, but the idea is for a label corresponding to an input, for example, where you have to write a username, then you'll give an ID on that input and put the same ID as the value for the HTML4 in the label. And now if you click on that label, it will focus on the corresponding input. This provides a better user experience and is really common in many different websites. However, this whole idea of putting the same value for the ID of the input as for the HTML4 of the label is constantly misused because you might be tempted to just use simple IDs like full name or email or something like that, right? However, this is bad because you might run into duplicate IDs inside of your app, so you should be using a unique identifier. In React 18, you now have a new hook called the UseId Hook, which as you're looking at the screen, all you have to do is you just have to create some sort of, you say const, then the name of the ID, let's just call it ID for now, and then set it equal to the UseId hook. This will generate a unique ID and set it equal to the constant that we just created. Now, if we want to, for example, use that as part of the ID for the input, we can just put it as the ID for the input and also put it inside of the HTML4. Now it will be just a random string of letters and numbers, and that means it is uniquely identified. Every time you refresh the page or re-render the component, this value will be different, meaning that there's no way that you will be repeating that number. This is really nice. However, it should only be used for this kind of situations and not for stuff like CSS IDs or class names, because it will auto-generate every single time the component re-render. So it won't be the same ID every single time, so it will be mismatched with whatever is in your CSS file. Also, make sure you're not using this inside of a list iteration in React. The user ID is not meant to be put inside of the key attribute in React, so don't do that. Just use it for its main purpose. Okay, so now that we talked about two different minor changes inside of this upgrade, I really need to start talking about the major things, right? So what exactly are they? The main point of this upgrade was to focus on concurrency, like I mentioned, and I want to explain to you guys a little bit about what exactly concurrent React is and introduce some of the new features that come with it. So first of all, this update establishes a distinction between what are urgent updates and transition updates. So when I say update, I mean like a state change or a function call, whatever. So something that happens in your application that changes stuff, right? So an urgent update basically would be something like typing or clicking or anything that can be perceived as immediate by the user. So why is that urgent? Because if I'm typing on an input and it is triggering some sort of update in our application, the typing is real time, right? So we can't have it as delayed because you're actually typing as a user. So data receiving from an API can be delayed because sometimes that happens. But when you're typing on an input, you want to see real-time changes, right? So that's why that is an urgent update. Now, a transition update is just an update that you don't mind waiting for. Now, it doesn't mean that it will take forever or take longer. It just means that if there's an urgent update, you want to prioritize that one instead of a transition update. So concurrent rendering in React is just basically prioritizing some sort of work or event while interrupting some rendering. A great example of this is having an input which, as the user types on it, it will trigger a re-render of a very long and expensive tree of components. Now, based on previous versions, every time you made a change to the input's value, meaning every time you type on your keyboard, even if it's just one character, React would treat both the update where you type on the input and the update where you re-render the tree of components with the same priority. Although it shouldn't, because whenever you type something else on the input and the rendering of the tree of components is not done yet, it should technically just stop that render, because now the input is showing something new, and it should trigger the re-render again based on previous versions every time you made a change in the input's value, meaning every time you typed something else on your keyboard, a new letter or deleted a letter. React would treat both the update of the input and the rendering of the component with the same priority. However, this doesn't make sense, because every time you type something new on the input, it will basically change completely what it should be showing in the screen. So why would it wait for the rendering of the component to be done when that thing is way more important, right? It is hard to visualize this if you're not dealing with very long lists or expensive component renderings. But it makes sense that if you're typing on your keyboard at a faster pace than it takes to load data or to display a component in your screen, then it doesn't make sense for you to treat both of them equally, right? Why would we need to wait for all of the expensive components in the list to render if we already typed another character in the input? This is very unnecessary and leads to very low performance. Also, it can make the input be out of sync with the UI sometimes, which is really bad. Now we have an API that actually tells React to defer certain updates while others are prioritized. So in the new version, there are actually two hooks that can help you with this. There is the useDeferredValue hook and there is the useTransition hook. The one I really want to talk about in this video is the useTransition hook. So for that, I actually came up with an example which I'm going to show you right now. In order to explain how the useTransition hook works, I created this very simple example here where it's just a normal application where there is two states. There is a show counter state and a count state. Basically, whenever we click on this button over here, it will not only increase this count value, which starts at 0, 1 by 1, so it will keep increasing by 1, but it will also keep toggling between showing the count value and not showing. So right now it's not showing, but if I click on it, it will become 1. If I click again, the number will become 2, but it will stop showing. When I click again, it will become 3 and it will show. So it kind of looks like it's incrementing by 2, but actually it's incrementing by 1. The only thing is we're hiding it, right? So obviously this example, I don't know where you would want to do something like this, but I found it to be kind of nice to actually explain how the hook works. So imagine in our situation over here, right? We have two states. However, one of the two states over here is more urgent than the other, right? Technically, let's picture this. Obviously, the example is not really aligned with a real life example, but it will make sense. Imagine that this state over here, the set count, is more urgent. The reason why it is more urgent is because we don't want to show the next state or next value before it updates, right? And the reason for that is because if I'm showing, the current value is 17, right? Or actually the current value is 18 because I just clicked again. It is hidden, but next time I click on it, I want to make sure that it is 19. So I want to put a priority on the set count state because this should run first. And then this one should run, right? This has a priority over this one. It doesn't matter the order because in states, it doesn't matter the order of where it is because it will only change the value when the component re-renders, right? So what happens is if I want to set one of them to be a priority state, what I can do is create what is known as a transition. So I'm going to import the useTransition hook from React over here, and I'm just going to destructure this hook by saying const equals to useTransition. And there's two things that I can get from here. I can get a boolean called isPending, which basically is just a boolean determining if the states are done, like the transition is done, right? So if you're loading the states or running the updates in your React application, this should be false while, or it should be true while it's running and should become false when it's finished. Then we have this function called startTransition. And this function over here is really interesting. It's the one that it's used to determine which updates are transitional updates and which ones are not. So instead of saying which of the states should be an urgent update, we're going to say which one should not be an urgent update. And in our case over here, this one should be a transitional update, not an urgent update. So I'm just going to wrap this around with the start transition function like this. And now whatever I put inside of this function will all become a transitional update, meaning that any other urgent updates that occur at the same time will be a priority for React. So how are we going to see this? Well, if I refresh this over here, it will start at 0, and then I can click and it will become 1. Now, what happens is usually how it was before, where both states are updated at the same time, right? They have the same priority. When I click again, it should basically not even display anything. It will become 2, but it won't display the thing because they both technically happen with the same priority. However, since the update of the count has a higher priority now, what should happen is you can kind of see the state updating really quickly before the show counter state updates, meaning that we should see this become 2 for like a small millisecond, and then it will hide. So if I click on this right now, you saw it became 2 for a millisecond. Now this obviously isn't something that is guaranteed. It all depends on how fast the update runs. It happens in most of them. You'll see that it will happen in most of them, but some of them might actually not happen. And this is happening because we told React to prioritize this update in our application rather than prioritizing this one over here equally. Now, what is the isPending Boolean over here? Well, this is just a Boolean determining, like I mentioned, if the update is done, right? If the transition is set. So I can actually in this example, it doesn't really make sense to do this, but in an example where you're handling data, for example, and the update is very expensive or it takes a while, you could put over here h1 tag saying something like loading, and you'll see that while the update is happening, it will very briefly, because in our case it's going super fast, but in very briefly, it will show that it's loading before it is done, right? So this is basically it for the UseTransition hook. It will be very useful. I can see many use cases. I'll go probably more in depth on it on my hooks video. However, you can see it will have many implications and a lot of people will use it for good in their application. Okay, everyone, and the last thing we're going to talk about is the Suspense component, which was introduced to React. However, this is actually something that has been talked about way before this version came out, because it is something that has been implemented in different libraries, and now, thankfully, it is actually integrated into the React core library for this new version. So it is a really cool thing, and I feel like it's going to be really useful. So for that reason, I came up with this little example over here, which is a really simple app. All it does is it fetches data from an API and it shows to you over here just a list of prices for crypto coins. Ignore the what it does. Just know that it is a list of data that I get from an API, right? You can see that when I refresh the browser, it will fetch the data for a second, and when it gets the data back, it will display it in our screen, right? So it doesn't show it immediately because it is making a request to the API, which is existent over here. And you can see to make the API request, I'm using the UseSWR library, which it's really useful for fetching data. I've used it a lot of times, but it is important that in this case, you use some sort of library, or you can do it yourself as well, but it is really nice to use some sort of library that will be compatible with how the Suspense component works in this version of React. And I'll go over why that is important in a bit. But basically, the whole point of this is the following. When you're fetching data, you usually have a loading state where it should display a spinner or some sort of text saying that the data is loading before it fully loads. This is very common in every application, and I would always recommend doing this. Now, before this, what would usually happen is you would keep track of the loading state by, for example, grabbing a variable over here called loading. It doesn't have to be this way, but you would have some sort of variable called loading, and you would do something like if loading is equal to true, then return either a spinner or just a text saying loading and 3 dots, right? This is a very common pattern, and it's important to understand because this is useful in many kinds of situations. Now, the issue with this is because when you're working with large-scale applications and you're trying to maintain some sort of consistency and a good pattern with your components, You should think about it this way. Your component should only worry about a certain things, a certain specific thing, right? In this case, it should worry about getting the data and returning the data. Now, if we have this loading state, this component is now worrying if the data is loading or not, and what it should return if it is loading or not, when it shouldn't be worrying about this, right? It can, right? There's no issue with implementing this kind of pattern, but the problem is that when you're dealing with a lot of components, this would probably get kind of annoying, right? You should always be trying to maintain your components having a single purpose and not actually putting a lot of stuff to it, because then it would become unorganized and it would probably not be consistent. So what the Suspense component does is it actually does all of this for you. If you come over here to where you actually want to add the loading kind of functionality, you could just pass a Suspense component that you import from React, and you just wrap it around where you want to kind of suspend the rendering of whatever's over here, depending on if the data is loading or not. Then you just pass a fallback component or UI that will be rendered if the data is still loading. So we'll just pass over here a little text saying loading and 3 dots, and we'll close this like this. Now what happens is you see absolutely nothing happens. It's still not working because in order for the Suspense component to actually understand what exactly if it is still loading or not, or if it failed, or if the data was correctly fetched, it actually needs to have some sort of response or some sort of status thrown through to them. Now you can do that manually, and you can follow the React documentation on how to do that manually, but I would recommend using some sort of library that would allow you to do that easily. The UseSWR, for example, allows you to do that very simply by just adding the Suspense. Actually, you need to put an object over here and pass Suspense is equal to true. When you do this over here, it will basically tell the data to be fetched, and while it's loading, it will throw the correct status code to the application so that this Suspense component over here knows that it's time to render the fallback. And now you can see that when I refresh the page, while it's loading the data, it will show the little loading thing over here. Now there is a caveat to that, right? It's not only important to do this because it prevents us from putting the loading logic inside of this component and just keeping it outside like this, but also because it allows us to prevent other stuff from being rendering while the data is loading. So what do I mean by that is, while the data is loading, I shouldn't see a text over here saying coin list, right? Because there's no coin list to be displayed. So if we put this inside of the Suspense, this will also not be displayed unless it is finished loading. And you'll see that this is exactly what happens. And this is amazing for the kinds of like pages, for example, where there's a lot of data being fetched on different components. Like imagine there's 3 different components over here, and data is being fetched on each of them individually, but you only want to display all of them when all of the components, all of the data in those individual components were correctly fetched, right? So you put that inside of the Suspense, and while each individual one of them is loading the data, this will be displayed. And when all of them finish, this will finally be displayed and rendered into your screen. Now, this is amazing. I was waiting for a long time for this to be done because it just helps in a lot of situations, especially when you're fetching data in a big application, because you're going to have to do that a lot of times. And you don't have to just use this once. You can do this for any kind of component groups, right? I can put this over here and it would work as well. So this is something that I really liked. It's one of the best changes. I will be using this in future videos if I ever need to. So keep that in mind. And yeah, that's basically it. So this is basically it for the video. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like down below and comment what you want to see next. Subscribe because I'm posting 2 to 3 times a week and I would massively appreciate it. I really hope you enjoyed this video. I try to go over as many things as I could, but also trying to make the video short while at the same time explaining the changes. They are complicated changes. I feel like this update was a bit different from all the other updates because it is a huge update, just like the one that introduced hooks to React. However, hooks is a much more beginner-friendly topic, while all of the topics introduced into this update is kind of more present in more advanced React. So a lot of the beginners won't really know the difference and won't really understand it. So that's something that was hard while I was making this video. But if you have any questions, just leave a comment down below and ask me what you want to understand. I'll be making more videos on React 18, so keep up with that. And yeah, that's basically it. I really hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I see you guys next time.